Hey everyone, today we are going to be making an Edmonton favorite, green onion cakes. So the recipe is pretty simple, not a lot of ingredients. It's pretty fast, easy, and they taste great. So let's take a quick look at the recipe. There's going to be two parts to this. So the first part is the dough, which is just going to use flour, baking powder, baking soda, and water. There's no yeast in this, so we don't have to wait around for anything to rise. Once it's ready to go, we can start frying them, and they should rise because of those chemical leaveners. The other part of this is going to be the inside. So the green onion mixture is going to have shortening, vegetable oil, sesame oil, salt, and green onions. If you don't have shortening, you can probably substitute that out for butter, lard, or margarine. Okay, so just in general, we're going to want to have about half a cup of fat. Alright, so our first order of business is to get that dough going. So here I have my 4 cups of flour. To that I'm going to add 1 teaspoon of baking powder. And then we need half of a teaspoon of baking soda, or sorry, 1/4. So just a little bit in there. And we need to have 450 mils of water. Now before I get to that, I'm just going to use my whisk. Just stir this up, make sure that everything is well distributed. I want the baking powder and baking soda to be very even through this. Okay. Now I'm going to use my wooden spoon again. Okay, so I'll open up a little bit of a well there, just so I can pour my water in there. And just like I did with the pizza dough, instead of using the spoon part of this, I'm just going to use the back of it instead. Okay, so just mix that in. This is going to be a bit of a wetter dough, so it should be wet and very moist, but it shouldn't be sticky. Okay, so if this ends up being a little bit sticky, we'll just have to add a little bit more flour to it. Okay, this looks good though. I think we shouldn't have any issues. Okay, so now that I get it to this point where it's mostly mixed in, I'm just gonna clean that off, and then I'll start kneading it inside of the bowl by hand. Okay, so just flip it over, push down, okay, and just keep rotating as you're doing that. Okay, I want to try and pull together as much of the ingredients as possible. Whenever you find a wet spot, just use that to try and pull up some of the dry ingredients that are still on the bottom. Alright, so I think it's good enough that I can take this out of the bowl and then knead it on the counter. Okay, so I got most of it out, which is good. That's what I want to see. And I'm just going to start kneading this until it's a bit smoother. Okay, I can feel this is very wet. Okay, so I'll just be a little careful there. Okay, there's definitely wet spots and dry spots right now. There we go. So this is, yeah, you can see it's pretty sticky, but it's still kind of holding together. I'm going to add a little bit more flour to that just so that it's a little bit less sticky and I can get some of this off my hands. Okay. Alright, so once we have this at a point where it's smooth and not sticky anymore, I can let this rest. And remember, the difference between this one and the pizza dough is that this one doesn't use yeast. It's not actually going to rise. I'm just going to let it sit inside of the bowl so that it'll relax a bit and be easier for me to roll out. Okay, so that's good. Okay, so that came together pretty good. So still soft, still very moist, but it's not sticky. So I'm just going to put that back into this bowl here. I'm just going to put a towel on top of that. you have the option of using plastic wrap or just a towel. This is only going to rest for about 20 minutes, so it should be fine with just a towel. Alright, so remember, you don't want to wipe all of this flour up with a cloth because it gets really sticky. So if you have something to scrape it with, try and get rid of most of the flour first before you go over this with a cloth. Okay, that's good. Yeah, remember, it's important to keep a nice clean workspace. Alright, so our next step here is going to be to prepare the filling. So here I've already trimmed up my green onions. I trimmed up all the tops so there aren't any dry spots on it. I cut off the roots on the end. Make sure once you do that you pull off the last layer. You want to have like a nice continuous layer to start with, otherwise there can often be dirt or dust inside of the little parts that have been cut off. Okay, so now we're just going to finely chop these. Okay, you want these to be as thin as possible. Okay, so take your time. You don't have to cut them super fast. Okay, you just want to try and make sure that they do get very thin, because we're going to have a thin layer that we end up frying here. Okay, you need about 3 or 4 green onions. I used 3 here because they were pretty big. So if they were a little bit smaller and thinner, I probably would have used 4. There we go. Okay, so I'm just going to put these off to the side for a minute. And the rest of my mixture starts off with 1/4 cup of shortening that's melted. Okay, so that's my first part here. To that, I need to add 1/4 cup of vegetable oil. Okay, so I have my grapeseed oil here. Add that in. Okay, and I also need 1 teaspoon of sesame oil. Okay, sesame oil has a great flavor. However, it is very strong, so you don't need a lot of it. So in this recipe, 1 teaspoon will be plenty. Put that in there. Okay. Then I have my green onions. Okay, I have a little bit left from another recipe, so I'll throw those in. And then the rest of the ones that we cut up. So if you want to make green onion cakes, you definitely have to like green onions, because there's a lot of them in there. Okay, and the last thing we need is 2 teaspoons of salt. And this will help give the whole thing a little bit of flavor. Remember that salt is one of those things that helps to bring out the flavors of other things. Okay, so whenever you feel that one of your recipes is a little bit flat, okay, so soups or breads or stir fries, it's probably because there isn't enough salt in there. Okay, so I'll just use a spoon to mix this up. We'll just let this sit on the side until we're ready to use it with our dough. Okay, our dough just needs another 10 minutes or so to rest, and then we should be good to get started. Okay, it's been about 20 minutes, so we're ready to start rolling out the dough. So what you want to do, just like all other bread products when you're going to roll them, give the counter a light dusting of flour. Okay, we can empty this out onto here. Okay, give it a little bit of flour on top. Make sure that's nice and coated. We don't want it to be too sticky. Right. So what we're going to try and do here is try and roll this out into a pretty big rectangle. And what we're going to do is spread the green onions on it, and then we'll roll it up into a little jelly roll, kind of like what you do for cinnamon buns, and then we'll cut them up. Okay, so it'd be best off if you start off with a roughly rectangular shape to start. Okay. Get a little bit more flour. When we're done with this, it should be approximately 1/4 of an inch thick. Okay, so we want it to definitely be longer than it is wide. Right, so. Okay, so sometimes when you see that it isn't really moving around as much, it's probably stuck to the bottom. So I can see here it's a little stuck, so I'm just gonna give it another dusting of flour. Okay, it's much easier if the bottom is dusted with flour because it'll move a lot faster and easier. Okay, so I got that. Alright. Okay, so try and make it as even as you possibly can. So I'm starting to go off on a bit of an angle, so I'll just try and correct this a little bit. One of the nice things with this, when you're working with dough, try and use your pin to isolate certain areas. Okay, so you want to look for some of the parts that are really thick and then just kind of work on those. Alright, so it is a very large rectangle, so if you want, you can actually just cut this in half instead and then just roll each one out individually and then just use half of your filling. So in this case, this is a good thickness. It is about 27 inches long and about 18 inches wide. Okay, so now that I have that done, I'm just going to put my filling in. Okay, so I'm just going to put that down to here and spread that out as much as I can. So you don't want it to be too thick with green onion in any particular place, so just try and move it around and spread it out as much as possible. Okay, so the way that this works, we're going to roll this up, and because of that we have these layers of fat in between. So when I eventually cook the dough, it's going to start puffing up, and the fat in between the layers is going to make it so that they'll actually separate, and that's why this becomes a more of a flaky kind of pastry because of these layers of fat. Okay, it's very similar to what you would do with a puff pastry, and I think there's others, like if you use a what's it called, phyllo. You have these layers of fat in between, and that's what makes them so light and fluffy. Now that I have this spread out, there, I'm just going to start rolling it up. Okay, and just going to start here and get my first part going. Okay, and then just continue the roll back and forth. And once you get a few rolls going, you can just use your hand to pull it. So here I can use this to just pull it forward. Ooh, it's a little bit stuck on the bottom, so yeah. If that happens, just pull it out and then roll forward. Okay. There you go. There. So, one big log. Right, so what I'm going to do now, I want to cut this into about 8 pieces. And before I do that, and if you notice, it's a little bit thicker in the middle than it is on the ends. So I'm just going to try and roll that out a little bit more. Okay. So I need to cut this into 8 pieces. So I'm going to go by halves here. And let's use my bread knife. So I'm going to cut this in half. Okay. So that means I now have to cut each of these into 4 pieces. Okay, so I just have to cut this one in half. So put it here. This will be in half. Actually, these are pretty big. I think I'm going to cut them into a couple more pieces. So there. I'm going to cut this into 12 pieces instead of 8. Okay, so 1, 2, 3, and 4, 5, and 6. 7, 8, 9, and then 10, 11, 12. Okay. So while you're working with these, this is basically what we should see, a nice roll with the green onions there. So what we want to do is seal these up. So I'm just gonna bring this forward and pinch that closed. Okay, I don't want all my green onions to fall out of there. So that's nice and sealed. Do the same thing on this end. Okay. And then what I'm gonna do next is I'm gonna twist this a little bit, like so. And then I'm going to push them together. Okay, so that's my little starting pancake. Okay, so I have to do 12 of those. So again, pinch, the end is closed. Same thing here. I want to twist and then press. Okay. Alright, so then you just have to do all 12 of those. Okay, so once you have them all done, what we're going to do is put them between a couple pieces of parchment just to flatten them out a little bit more. Okay, so I'm just going to put a little bit of flour down here. So I'm going to take one of those. I'm going to put another sheet on top and then just flatten it out. Okay, so I want these to be pretty thin before I decide to fry them. Okay, you can do this by hand, or you could use a rolling pin if you want instead. Okay, so you want them to be pretty thin, so about that thick. It's about 1/4 inch again. Okay. So just work on those and you can start stacking them. Alright, so see what it's like without the flour on there. That works out pretty well too. Okay, so there. I have a nice stack of flattened out pieces of dough. So what I'm going to do now is start frying them. I have my pan heating over medium-high heat. I'm just going to add a few tablespoons of oil. We're just going to be lightly frying these. Okay, so I'm going to start off with one at a time, and I'm going to fry each side until it gets to a golden brown color. So I don't want to flip it until it actually is brown. Okay, so this first one. Go. So as this is cooking, the baking powder inside of the dough should activate and should start puffing up. And once it puffs up really well, I'm probably going to be at the point where I can start checking if the bottom has started browning, and then I can flip it over. So it's a little bit hard to tell, but we basically started off with something that's about this thick, about 1/4 inch, so it's pretty thin. And now it's already puffed up to double that. So when you look at it from the side, it's significantly thicker than when we first put it in. It said it's been about 2 to 3 minutes. I can see right here it's starting to puff up really nice. So I'm gonna see what the underside looks like. Yeah, so see it's a nice golden brown. So I'm just gonna flip this over. It said it's been about 2 to 3 minutes. I can see right here it's starting to puff up really nice. So I'm gonna see what the underside looks like. Yeah, so see it's a nice golden brown. So I'm just gonna flip this over. So in this case, I'd say about 2 to 3 minutes per side is probably good. It's good to move it around just to make sure that you get a good coating of oil on the bottom. Make sure it fries up real nice. When they're done, I'm just going to put them onto this plate with a little bit of paper towel just to soak up some of the extra oil. Looking at the size of the pan, I probably could get another one in here if I can find one that's about the right shape. So I can see. This will probably do. So I'll just start on the second one while this first one finishes off. There you go. Alright, so when you look at them, you can definitely see the thickness difference between the two of them, between start and finish. So that side's nice and brown. I'm just going to flip it back over. I want it to get a little bit more brown than it is right now. Alright, I just gave it a flip, and this is about the amount of brown that I'm looking for. Okay, so just a little bit more done. But look at this one, this is definitely puffing up well, so I'm just going to flip that one over. Oh yeah, that's good. Alright, so in total I'm thinking probably about 4 or 5 minutes per side, because we want it to get really brown. It's going to depend on how hot your pan is. Mine is at about just a little bit more than medium. So if you have it on high, it'll definitely be faster. You just have to be careful to make sure that it doesn't burn. Okay, so this is good. So I'm just going to put that one on the side here, and then I'll just keep going with this. Here they are, all done. So each one is a nice golden brown, and they fried up very nicely. If you find that there's a little too much for you, what you can do is just leave them in the parchment paper, just put them in a Ziploc bag, and then you can freeze them. So I'm going to freeze these 6 for later, just so that I can have some fresh ones. When you decide to eat these, they are very good if you have them with a little bit of Thai chili sauce. So that's how you make the green onion cakes. So go ahead and enjoy.